The Ancient City, Book 5. The Municipal Regime Disappears. Chapter 1. New Beliefs. Philosophy changes the principles and the rules of politics. In what precedes, we have seen how the municipal governments were constituted among the ancients. A very ancient religion had at first founded the family, and afterwards the city. At first it had established domestic law and government of the gens. Afterwards it had established civil laws and municipal government. The state was closely allied with religion. It came from religion and was confounded with it. For this reason, in the primitive city, all political institutions had been religious institutions. The festivals had been ceremonies of the worship. The laws had been sacred formulas, and the kings and magistrates had been priests. For this reason, too, individual liberty had been unknown, and man had not been able to withdraw even his conscience from the omnipotence of the city. For this reason also, the state remained bounded by the limits of a city, and had never been able to pass the boundaries which its national gods had originally traced for it. Every city had not only its political independence, but also its worship and its code. Religion, law, government, all were municipal. The city was the single living force. There was nothing above and nothing below it, neither national unity nor individual liberty. It remains for us to relate how this system disappeared. That is to say, how, the principle of human association being changed, government, religion, and law threw off this municipal character which they had borne in antiquity. The ruin of the governments which Greece and Italy had created was due to two principal causes. One belonged to the order of moral and intellectual facts, the other to the order of material facts. The first is the transformation of beliefs. The second is the Roman conquest. These two great facts belong to the same period. They were developed and accomplished together during the series of 6 centuries which preceded our era. The primitive religion, whose symbols were the immovable stone of the hearth and the ancestral tomb, a religion which had established the ancient family and had afterwards organized the city, changed with time and grew old. The human mind increased in strength and adopted new beliefs. Men began to have an idea of immaterial nature. The notion of the human soul became more definite, and almost at the same time, that of a divine intelligence sprang up in their minds. Could they still believe in the divinities of the primitive ages, of those dead men who lived in the tomb, of those lares who had been men, of those holy ancestors whom it was necessary to continue to nourish with food? Such a faith became impossible. Such beliefs were no longer on a level with the human mind. It is quite true that these prejudices, though rude, were not easily eradicated from the vulgar mind. They still reigned there for a long time, but from the 5th century before our era, reflecting men freed themselves from these errors. They had other ideas of death. Some believed in annihilation, others in a second and entirely spiritual existence in a world of spirits. In these cases, they no longer admitted that the dead lived in the tomb, supporting themselves upon offerings. They also began to have too high an idea of the divine to persist in believing that the dead were gods. On the contrary, they imagined the soul going to seek its recompense in the Elysian fields, or going to pay the penalty of its crimes, and, by a notable progress, they no longer deified any among men except those whom gratitude or flattery placed above humanity. The idea of the divinity was slowly transformed by the natural effect of the greater power of the mind. This idea, which man had at first applied to the invisible force which he felt within himself, he transported to the incomparably grander powers which he saw in nature, whilst he was elevating himself to the conception of a being who was without and above nature. Then the Lares and Heroes lost the adoration of all who thought. As to the sacred fire, which appears to have had no significance, except so far as it was connected with the worship of the dead, that also lost its prestige. Men continued to have a domestic fire in the house, to salute it, to adore it, and to offer it libations, but this was now only a customary worship, which faith no longer vivified. The public hearth of the city, or prytaneum, was insensibly drawn into the discredit into which the domestic fire had fallen. Men no longer knew what it signified. They had forgotten that the ever-living fire of the prytaneum represented the invisible life of the national ancestors, founders, and heroes. They continued to keep up the fire, to have public meals, and to sing the old hymns, vain ceremonies of which they dared not free themselves, but the sense of which no one understood. Even the divinities of nature, which they had associated with the sacred fire, changed their character. After having commenced by being domestic divinities, after having become city divinities, they were transformed again. Men finally perceived that the different beings whom they called by the name of Jupiter might be only one and the same being, and thus of the other gods. The mind was oppressed with the multitude of divinities, and felt the need of reducing their number. Men understood that the gods no longer belonged each to a family or to a city, but that they all belonged to the human race, and watched over the universe. Poets went from city to city and taught men, instead of the old hymns of the city, new songs wherein neither Lares nor city-protecting divinities appeared, and where the legends of the great gods of heaven and earth were related, and the Greek people forgot their old domestic and national hymns for this new poetry, which was not the daughter of religion, but of art and of a free imagination. At the same time, a few great sanctuaries, like those of Delphi and Delos, attracted men and made them forget their local worship. The mysteries and the doctrines which these taught accustomed them to disdain the empty and meaningless religion of the city. Thus an intellectual revolution took place, slowly and obscurely. Even the priests made no opposition, for as long as the sacrifices continued to be offered on designated days, it seemed to them that the ancient religion was preserved. Ideas might change and faith perish, provided the rites received no attack. It happened, therefore, without the practices being modified, that the beliefs were transformed, and that the domestic and municipal religion lost all influence over the minds of men. Then philosophy appeared, and overthrew all the rules of the ancient polity. It was impossible to touch the opinions of men without also touching the fundamental principles of their government. Pythagoras, having a vague conception of the supreme being, disdained the local worships, and this was sufficient to cause him to reject the old modes of government and to attempt to found a new order of society. Anaxagoras comprehended the God intelligence which reigns over all men and all beings. In rejecting ancient religious notions, he also rejected ancient polity. As he did not believe in the gods of the Prytaneum, he no longer fulfilled all the duties of a citizen. He avoided the assemblies, and would not be a magistrate. His doctrine was an attack upon the city, and the Athenians condemned him to death. The Sophists came afterwards, and exercised more influence than these two great minds. They were men eager to combat old errors. In the struggle which they entered against whatever belonged to the past, they did not spare the institutions of the city more than they spared religious prejudices. They boldly examined and discussed the laws which still reigned in the state and in the family. They went from city to city, proclaiming new principles, teaching not precisely indifference to the just and the unjust, but a new justice, less narrow, less exclusive than the old, more humane, more rational, and freed from the formulas of preceding ages. This was a hardy enterprise, which stirred up a tempest of hatred and rancor. They were accused of having neither religion, nor morals, nor patriotism. The truth is that they had not a very well settled doctrine, and thought they had done enough when they had attacked old prejudices. They moved, as Plato says, what had been immovable. They placed the rule of religious sentiment and that of politics in the human conscience, and not in the customs of ancestors, in immutable tradition. They taught the Greeks that to govern a state it was not enough to appeal to old customs and sacred laws, but that men should be persuaded and their wills should be influenced. For the knowledge of ancient customs they substituted the art of reasoning and speaking, dialectics and rhetoric. Their adversaries quoted tradition to them, while they, on the other hand, employed eloquence and intellect. When reflection had thus been once awakened, man no longer wished to believe without giving a reason for his belief, or to be governed without discussing his institutions. He doubted the justice of his old social laws, and other principles dawned upon his mind. Plato puts these remarkable words in the mouth of a sophist. "All you who are here I regard as related to each other. Nature, in default of law, has made you citizens, but the law, that tyrant of man, does violence to nature on many occasions." Thus, to oppose nature to law and custom was to attack the ancient political system at its foundation. In vain did the Athenians banish Protagoras and burn his writings. The blow had been struck. The result of the teachings of the Sophists had been immense. The authority of old institutions perished with the authority of the national gods, and the habit of free examination became established in men's homes and in the public squares. Socrates, while reproving the abuse which the Sophists made of the right to doubt, was still of their school. Like them, he rejected the empire of tradition, and believed that the rules of conduct were graven in the human conscience. He differed from them only in this: he studied conscience religiously, and with a firm desire to find there an obligation to be just and to do good. He ranked truth above custom, and justice above the law. He separated morals from religion. Before him, men never thought of a duty except as a command of the ancient gods. He showed that the principle of duty is in the human mind. In all this, whether he wished it or not, he made war upon the city worship. In vain he took pains to be present at all the festivals and took part in the sacrifices. His belief and his words contradicted his conduct. He founded a new religion, which was the opposite of the city religion. He was justly accused of not adoring the gods whom the state adored. Men put him to death for having attacked the customs and the beliefs of their ancestors, or, as they expressed it, for having corrupted the present generation. The unpopularity of Socrates and the violent rage of the citizens are explained if we think of the religious habits of that Athenian society, where there were so many priests, and where they were so powerful. But the revolution which the Sophists had commenced, and which Socrates had taken up with more moderation, was not stopped by the death of the old man. Greek society was enfranchised more and more daily from the empire of old beliefs and old institutions. After him, philosophers freely discussed the principles and rules of human association. Plato, Crito, Antisthenes, Speusippus, Aristotle, Theophrastus, and many others wrote treatises on politics. They studied and examined the great problems of the organization of a state, of authority and obedience, of obligations and rights, were presented to all minds. Doubtless thought could not easily free itself from the bonds which habit had made for it. Plato still yielded in certain points to the empire of old ideas. The state which he imagines is still the ancient city. It is small. It must not contain more than 5,000 members. Its government is still regulated on ancient principles. Liberty is unknown in it. The object which the legislator proposes to himself is less the perfection of man than the security and grandeur of the association. The family, even, is almost suppressed, that it may not come into competition with the city. The state is the only proprietor. It alone is free. The state alone has a will. Only the state has a religion and a belief, and whoever does not believe with it must perish. And yet, in the midst of all this, the new ideas appear. Plato proclaims, with Socrates and the Sophists, that the moral and political guide is in ourselves, that tradition is nothing, that reason must be consulted, and that laws are just only when they conform to human nature. These ideas are still more precise in Aristotle. The law, he says, is reason. He teaches that we are to seek not what conforms to the customs of ancestors, but what is good in itself. He adds that, as time progresses, institutions should be modified. He puts aside respect for ancestors. Our first ancestors, whether they came from the bosom of the earth or survived some deluge, resembled in all probability those who today are the most degraded and the most ignorant among men. It would be an evident absurdity to cling to the opinions of those men. Aristotle, like all the philosophers, absolutely disregards the religious origin of human society. He does not speak of the Prytaneum. He does not admit that these local worships were the foundation of the state. The state, he says, is nothing else but an association of equal beings seeking in common a happy and comfortable existence. Thus, philosophy rejects the old principles of society and seeks a new foundation on which it may support social laws and the idea of country. The Cynic school goes farther. It denies the ties of country itself. Diogenes boasted that he had the rights of a citizen nowhere, and Crates said that his country was a contempt for the opinions of others. The Cynics added this truth, then quite new, that man is a citizen of the universe, and that his country is not the narrow territory of a city. They considered municipal patriotism as a prejudice, and excluded love of the city from the moral sentiments. From disgust or disdain, philosophers avoided public affairs more and more. Socrates had fulfilled the duties of a citizen, and Plato had attempted to work for the state by reforming it. Aristotle, still more indifferent, confined himself to the part of an observer, and made the state an object of scientific study. The Epicureans paid no attention to public affairs. "Do not meddle with them," said Epicurus, "unless some higher power compels you to." The Cynics did not wish even to be citizens. The Stoics returned to politics. Zeno, Cleanthes, and Chrysippus wrote numerous treatises on the government of states, but their principles were far removed from the old municipal politics. These are the terms in which one of the ancients speaks of the doctrines which their writings contained. Zeno, in his treatise on government, has undertaken to show us that we are not the inhabitants of such a deme or such a city, separated from each other by a particular code or exclusive laws, but that we should see citizens in all men, as if we all belonged to the same deme and the same city. We see from this how far ideas had advanced since the age of Socrates, who thought himself bound to adore, as far as he was able, the gods of the state. Even Plato did not plan any other government than that of a city. Zeno passed beyond these narrow limits of human associations. He disdained the divisions which the religion of ancient ages had established. As he believed in a God of the universe, so he had also the idea of a state into which the whole human race should enter. But here is a still newer principle. Stoicism, by enlarging human association, emancipates the individual. As it rejects the religion of the city, it rejects also the servitude of the citizen. It no longer desires that the individual man shall be sacrificed to the state. It distinguishes and separates clearly what ought to remain free in a man, and frees at least the conscience. It tells man that he ought to shut himself up within himself, to find in himself duty, virtue, and reward. It does not forbid him to meddle with public affairs. It even invites him to affairs of state, still warning him, however, that his principal labor ought to have for its object his individual improvement, and that whatever the government may be, his conscience ought to remain free. A great principle which the ancient city had always disregarded, but which was destined to become one of the most sacred rules of politics. Men now begin to understand that there are other duties besides those towards the state, other virtues besides civic virtue. The mind is attached to other objects besides country. The ancient city had been so powerful and so tyrannical that man had made it the object of all his labor and of all his virtues. It had been his standard of the beautiful and the good, and except for that, there was no heroism. But now Zeno teaches man that he has a dignity, not as a citizen, but as a man, that besides his obligations to the law, he has others to himself, and that the supreme merit is not to live or die for the state, but to be virtuous and to please the deity. These were somewhat selfish virtues, which left national independence and liberty to fall, but they gave the individual more importance. The public virtues went on declining, while the personal virtues were evolved and came forth into the world. They had at first to struggle both against the general corruption and against despotism. But they became rooted in the minds of men by degrees, and, as time went on, became a power which every government had to take into account. And it was of the first importance that the rules of politics should be modified so that a free place might be made for them. Thus were these religious notions transformed, little by little. The municipal religion, the basis of the city, disappeared, and the municipal governments, such as the ancients had conceived them, were forced to fall with it. Insensibly, men departed from those rigorous rules and from those narrow forms of government. Higher ideas prompted men to form more extensive societies. They were attracted towards unity. This was the general aspiration for 2 centuries preceding our era. The fruits which these revolutions of knowledge bore were, it is true, very slow to mature. But we shall see, in studying the Roman conquest, that events moved in the same direction with these ideas, and that, like them, they tended to the ruin of the old municipal system, and that they prepared new modes of government.